I only read one book, but it's a good book, don't you know? I act the way I act because the good book tells me so. If I want to know how to be good, it's to the good book that I go. Because the good book is a book, and it is good, and it's a book.
And it came to pass, at the end of 2 full years after the events of the previous chapter, where we left our brave hero chained unto a wall in Pharaoh's prison, during which nothing of any interest happened, unless, of course, copious amounts of prison rape, out of interest, that Pharaoh, who had enjoyed mightily the herb before he did retire for the night, dreamed. And behold, like in many dreams that the Pharaoh did have, that were cinematic and foreboding, he stood by the river, and ominous music that did suggest the imminent appearance of a shark did play. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favoured kine, and fat shed, and they fed in a meadow. For in those days kine, which for those who don't know, or who haven't already guessed, are cows, lived under water, in rivers, and frightened the crocodiles in the Nile, who would otherwise feed upon them. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favoured and lean-fleshed, shuffling slowly upon their hoofs, staring out into the distance with their tongues hanging out, and mooing in a way that did sound more like a moan, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And then it did become apparent that the thin cows were in fact zombie cows, when the ill-favoured and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favoured and fat kine, and those that did watch did know us not that the only way to stop them was with a headshot. So Pharaoh awoke, literally shitting himself. And when he had got cleaned up, and had changed the bedding, he slept, and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good, and this dream did appear to share a common theme with the previous one, so thou can guess where it would be going. And behold, without being surprising to anyone, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them, with a loud boing sound. And in a scene that would dissuade anyone watching it from ever wanting to venture into a cornfield again, the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears, as a strange orange fruit, that did have upon it a human face, did look on, and sing a song, composed entirely of the verse, I know a song that'll get on your nerves. And after 337 identical verses of this song, Pharaoh awoke, and did grab hold of the first heavy item that he could find, and did go looking for the orange fruit, which, had he been able to find, he would surely have beaten into a pulp, thus inventing fresh orange juice as a breakfast item. But, behold, it was a dream, and the Pharaoh did have to make do with Rice Krispies instead. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof, who, as luck would have it, did just happen to all live within quick and easy walking distance of the Pharaoh's palace. And Pharaoh told them his dream, including all the very clear and simple metaphors that did involve what were at the time the 2 staple food sources for the people of Egypt, the act of consumption that would result in being left with a poorly nourished and wizened outcome, but because this was obviously a plot device that would advance Joseph's adventure, there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. But a few of the magicians did know some good card tricks, and could make rabbits, handkerchiefs, and paper flowers appear out of various orifices, and coins from behind Pharaoh's ear. And one of them, who was both short and irritating, and was, with one swift action, even able to pull his own hair out from off his own head, from under his hat without his hat falling off, and after doing so did exclaim to all present, Now that's magic! And the Pharaoh did agree that it was indeed magic, and he did like it, but not a lot. Then, having suddenly remembered something rather important that he did realize that he should probably have mentioned a couple of years previously, then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and quite justifiably so, if I may add, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker, for we did both deserve our fate, and there is no argument about that. And Pharaoh did hie his servant with a quizzical look, and the butler did carefully continue. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream, which was naturally the kind of amazing coincidence that does crop up from time to time in stories such as this, that doth present an unlikely mechanism by which a principal character could escape a seemingly inescapable situation. And as luck would have it, there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard, who, according to the chapter previously, was really a fellow prisoner also, a slave thrown into jail for raping his master's wife. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. For you may not be aware that prison is like that, and it's not uncommon for prisoners to talk amongst themselves about the dreams they do have, and be all touchy-feely. And quite amazingly it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged, though granted the lad did predict that the baker would be beheaded. But who's going to argue at the sentence is handed down when the outcome is very much the same? Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, where he had been killing orcs, on a quest for a set of magic armour. And as this was the first time that he had been out of the basement for years, he shaved himself and changed his raiment, for the t-shirt he was wearing was covered in food stains, and he had not changed it since the band whose logo it did carry had been popular rather than considered classic rock as it was now. And in an unfortunate turn of phrase that did suggest that he did overstep royal etiquette, came in unto Pharaoh. And once he had regained his composure, straightened his hair and wiped his mouth, Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it, and I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it, thus, in a technical sense, at least, make thee the man of mine dreams. And using the same line, used by those known as faith healers in centuries to come, Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh did consider this for a moment, and then did say unto him, Okay, it doth look like I am talking to the wrong person. If thou hast God's number, I shall be very grateful for it, for I shall give him a call, and thee can go us back unto thine dungeon. And Joseph did say, Well, if thou put it that way, how can I help? And as the scene blurred and changed to a flashback of the dream sequence we did encounter at the beginning of this chapter, Pharaoh said unto Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, of course, being the crocodile-infested river Nile that doth flow through Egypt. And as before, because the original scribe was getting paid by the verse, behold, they came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favoured, with their legs literally creaking under the weight of them, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, yet again, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and ill-favoured and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt, for badness and pieces of their flesh did occasionally drop off, as they did lurch from side to side, as they did shuffle out of the water, each with a wild vacant stare. And the lean and the ill-favoured kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine, because the fat kine were so large that they could not run away from the slowly shuffling zombie kind without having to stop for a breather every few yards, and they were upon them like size 0 fashion models upon a cake. And when they'd eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favoured, as at the beginning, which would have made size 0 fashion models everywhere insanely jealous, but was entirely logical, as it is widely known that there is no such thing as an overweight zombie. So I awoke. And because repeating and reusing material from earlier didn't add to the production cost in any way, Pharaoh continued. I saw in my dream, and, behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And Joseph did stop Pharaoh and ask him if he was awake when he had this dream, or if he'd gone back to sleep again. And Pharaoh did think for a minute, and did ask if it did matter. And Joseph did say it did, for if he did have these kinds of dream when he was awake, then he should probably stop licking the bits of paper with the smiley faces on them and leave off the herb for a while. And after a pause, Pharaoh did say that he had indeed gone back to sleep before dreaming, and he did continue. And behold, 7 ears, withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind, spring up after them. And Joseph did ask if they were normal ears, or pointy ears, or as they were ears on stalks, were they Shrek ears? And Pharaoh did look at Joseph in a stern way. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. Yet lo, like the cattle, this did not as turn them into big ears. And Noddy was most disappointed. And Pharaoh said, I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. And Joseph did think unto himself that Pharaoh wouldst have had more luck had he told the story unto a person who would be known as a psychiatrist, who wouldst be able to prescribe unto him some tablets and recommend that he doth avoid drinking orange juice or eating cheese before bedtime. But he did think it best not to point this out. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, The dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. And Pharaoh did ask Joseph how such dreams could indicate that he was about to beat a slave within an inch of his life, and then throw him in unto a scorpion pit if he did not get us unto the damn point. And Joseph continued, and with an almost uncanny ability for spotting the meaning of an obvious metaphor, said, The 7 good kine are 7 good years, and the 7 good years are 7 good years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favoured kine that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty years, blasted with east wind, shall be 7 years of famine. Because spotting the bleeding obvious was apparently a skill in short supply in Egypt in those days. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do he hath showeth unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh did ask unto Joseph, Why would God do such a thing as send a famine upon my land? Has the nation of Egypt, with me as its leader, angered God in some way? And then he did ask which of the numerous Egyptian gods Joseph was indeed referring to when he did say God. And Joseph did point out that he was in fact talking about his God, the God of his father, and that his God didn't need to have a reason to do arseholish things that would cause the needless death of thousands throughout the land and beyond through slow starvation, and that being an all-powerful and, above all-loving God, he brought about things like famines all the time. And Pharaoh did ask Joseph if, as his God was all-powerful and all-loving, he could have a word with his God and ask him to possibly not cast down a famine upon his land. And Joseph did think about this for a while. And in an attempt to add a positive spin on the situation, Joseph said, Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh did say, Yes, and then what happens? And in a quieter voice, he had to admit that there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And Pharaoh did say unto him, Now, you see that bit? That's the bit that I doth have a problem with. Why canst not we have yet another 7 years of plenty? And Joseph, who had completely missed the point of Pharaoh's question, said, but the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And Pharaoh looked at him and asked why. And Joseph was stumped, and did have to admit that the whole famine thing was probably some overarching plot device, or the backdrop to a more far-reaching narrative that would unfold over the progress of time, in a possible sequel to the narrative that they did find themselves in, without which that which will unfold hence would have no reason to happen, and so cannot be used in centuries hence to justify a number of rather despicable, immoral, and cruel acts. And at that, all present did pause and look about the scene in a way that might indicate that they were suddenly aware that they were being watched by an unseen observer. And after a few moments, Joseph did pick back up where hence he had left off, and said, For that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and send him over the land of Egypt. And he did once again innocently look around the room at nothing in particular, whistling and occasionally clearing his throat in a less than obvious manner of being obvious. And then he realized that Pharaoh had not yet taken the hint, and was still waiting for more detailed advice, and said, Let Pharaoh do this, or maybe someone that Pharaoh might appoint, though I cannot think of any one in particular that might fit the bill. And let him appoint officers over the land, and take up 1/5 part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And Pharaoh did think about this, and then did say, So thou art proposing a 20% tax on all produce, which shall be paid unto me, and put aside for the common good. And Joseph did agree. And Pharaoh did say that he was uncomfortable with this idea, for it did sound like socialism. And Joseph continued, And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh. And let them keep food in the cities. And though this would be a good and sound plan that would greatly benefit everyone and prevent widespread starvation throughout the land, those who would be known in centuries hence as Tea Party Republicans and Libertarians would argue that this stockpiling for the common good was indeed not just a thing called socialism, but further still, it was indeed communism, and did constitute an unfair tax on the producers in society, and that there should be some personal responsibility for everyone, and that others should make their own personal preparations, even if they were just slaves, and therefore not able, for this was surely their own fault. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that you only have your own imagination as proof of occurring, that the land perish not through the famine, because best before dates of 14 years were quite common in those days. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all his servants, although the news from Anubis and those who would follow it would say that this thing was unconstitutional, and that unless they did stop it from happening, it would end the country as they did know it, and they did want to take their country back. And with Pharaoh's blessing, Joseph did indeed grant them their wish, and did take them back unto a time of the flood, and did round them all up, and throw them in the river with the crocodiles. And Pharaoh, who wasn't a Hebrew, but instead worshipped the heathen Egyptian gods of Horus and Amun-Ra, and not the God of Joseph's father, even though the mythology of the two will be seen in centuries to come to be strikingly similar, said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And all did look and point at Joseph and say, Duh! And God said unto Pharaoh, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art, and though it all does sound entirely plausible once thou do explain it, and I am sure that thou didst not simply pull the explanation from thine back passage, so in the absence of the organ grinder I shall employ his monkey. Thou shalt be over mine house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And with that did Pharaoh make Joseph, a slave with delusions of grandeur, hated by his brethren and accused of rape, his second in command, simply for interpreting a dream. And he did wonder unto himself if this was because he had climbed out of that shepherd's hut window several chapters ago, or if it was because the narrative had taken on a life of its own, as narratives such as this often do, to ensure that the plot of a rags to riches story doth conclude with a happy ending. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt, and when the word of this doth leak out, there will be those who doth wear tricorn hats and knee breeches, or comb over their hair to hide their baldness, who will demand to see thy birth certificate, and will insist that thou art a Muslim, who was born in Kenya. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck, and would have married unto him that day, had it not been for a constitutional amendment outlining marriage that forbade him from doing so. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, which no doubt was a great burden for Joseph. And they cried before him, Bow the knee, lest we chop your head off for not doing so. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And when news of this did reach the ear of the captain of the guard's wife, she did hurriedly pack up all her belongings, and was gone before the guards bearing Joseph's orders did arrive at her house. And she was never seen again, which did make Joseph's former master, Potiphar, very happy indeed. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name, fucked if I can say it, which did roughly translate into English as potential scapegoat. Or more accurately, if this all goes tits up, thine Pharaoh will have thine balls in a vice by sundown. And to stifle any rumours, he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potipharnath, priest of On, who did indeed have an ass and a half. And Joseph went out of all the land of Egypt, for he was well served, by bitches and hoes, adorned with bling, and in the mood to party until Ra turned up. And having spent almost half his life so far as either a slave or in prison, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, and went throughout all of the land of Egypt, which he found to be mostly parched desert, where nobody lived and nothing grew. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls, though in latter years, many centuries hence, with the aid of a thing called science, things called chemical fertilizers and pesticides will be created from the mind of man, and the strains of corn will be improved by crossbreeding, and the land will be watered by a thing called irrigation, so that the crops may grow in the desert, and the same earth that in this time did bring forth by handfuls will bring forth by the lorry load, in quantities that are unimaginable in these times. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years, which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up in the same, which was fine for things like corn. However, the food at the bottom of the salad crisper had become more of a foul-smelling grey soup, and in the absence of a cold store, the meat was in the process of being reanimated and escaping. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. For being a goat herder in the back end of beyond, a degree in bookkeeping was not a requirement, and so the quantity of corn did become too great to count shortly after Joseph had taken off his shoes. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons, before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Pottinchet, priest of On, bare unto him, presumably when they were out in the deep desert looking for farmers. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manas. For God, said he, hath made me forget all my toil, and all my father's house, but mainly because he did like the sound of Manas. And the name of the second called he Ephraim. For God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction, but mainly because people in these times name their kids as if they were trying to make a political statement, rather than because the name sounded nice. And because for those 7 years the farmers of Egypt and the lands beyond had raped the land until nothing more could come out of it, so that they could produce enough corn to go into storage as well as feed themselves, the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth became to come, according as Joseph had said in his self-fulfilling prophecy, and the dearth was in all lands. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread, so that as they could at least make sandwiches. But alas, they did have nothing to put in them, and a great many wives went into the kitchen, and were unable to complete their duty. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph. What he saith to do, do. which was the first officially recorded instance of the head of a nation blaming the Jews for something, and would be something that would remain popular for many centuries until it would be taken to its logical conclusion, whereafter it would be frowned upon. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses, and sold into the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And nobody did complain that, having run the corn market into the ground to create a shortage, he was now selling the corn back unto the people. And lo, as he had obtained the corn, as a levy decreed by Pharaoh, and so at no cost, every penny that he did take in exchange for it was pure profit. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all the lands, and with that Joseph did exceed the exploits of his forebears by achieving the holy grail of getting everyone in the land and far beyond to give him their possessions for fear of loss, so that he could later sell them right back to them. And lo, with this concept he did invent international banking and the insurance industry. And in a tent, at the edge of an encampment in the middle of a desert many years hence, the Lord did listen unto an old bearded man, who did recount the narrative he had just written unto him, whilst the Lord had been playing Halo on the Xbox. For, of all the games he could find, that one did sound the most righteous, and indeed it was. And after he did finish, the Lord did say unto him, "Don't you think people might realize that it's basically a fanciful retelling of the legend of Imhotep?" And the man did think for a moment, and then did say, "Only if they know who Imhotep was." And the Lord did consider that those who did follow his word in centuries to come would indeed be unlikely to know who Imhotep was, other than a living dead monster, covered in bandages, and would not realize that he was indeed a brilliant man, who was born centuries before his time, who also rose from being a lowly commoner to becoming a physician, a statesman, a high priest, an engineer, and an architect, and did design and build Egypt's first pyramid, and, as legend would say, brought to an end a 7-year famine, and was considered to be the son of a god after he died. Yet still there would be those who would think that Imhotep and Joseph were indeed the same person, discounting completely the fact that the two were separated by 1,000 years, and Imhotep was building pyramids before Noah was building boats. And the man thought for a while, and then did say unto the Lord, "Well, my version is better, because though that guy might have been a genius, he didn't have a multicolored jacket."